Christmas dinner was supposed to be simple that year. Just family pot roast and the sound of rain tapping against the windows. But before I even knocked on the door, I heard something that stopped me cold. My parents were inside, calmly planning to move my sister's family into my $350,000 condo while I'd be overseas for free. I stood there on the welcome mat, soaked from the Seattle rain, listening to my life being rearranged without me. And in that quiet moment, I made a decision. I wouldn't interrupt. I'd let them finish the plan. The rain in Seattle that night wasn't gentle. It was the kind that soaked through your coat in minutes and turned the sidewalks into mirrors of blurred streetlights. I stood on the welcome mat outside my parents' house, water dripping from the edge of my sleeves, my hand hovering just inches from the brass knocker. That's when I heard my name. The voices inside were muffled by the thick oak door and the steady rain, but the meaning came through perfectly clear. "Morgan makes six figures," Blake was saying. My brother-in-law always had that tone, confident in a way that somehow sounded borrowed. "She doesn't need a 2,000 square foot loft all to herself." My hand froze. Through the narrow gap in the curtains, I could see them gathered around the dining table, like they were planning a campaign. My sister Sabrina sat wrapped in a blanket, one hand resting on her baby bump, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue like she'd been practicing the scene all afternoon. My parents, Richard and Susan, leaned toward her with matching expressions of concern. "But what if she says no?" Sabrina asked softly. My father answered before anyone else could. "She won't get the chance." I felt something inside my chest go very still. "Once you're inside and getting mail there," he continued, his voice calm, almost instructional. "You establish residency, squatters' rights. She'd have to go through formal eviction in this city that takes 6 months minimum." My mother laughed, a short, satisfied sound. "And she's leaving for that deployment in Tokyo in January anyway," Susan added. 3 full months. We'll have the nursery painted and the locks changed before she even lands." For a moment, I just stood there in the rain, listening to them discuss the logistics of taking my home, the way people talk about rearranging furniture. My loft, the one I'd spent years restoring brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. 15 years of 70-hour weeks as a strategic risk analyst had turned that place into more than an apartment. It was the one thing in my life that belonged entirely to me. And inside that dining room over pot roast and Christmas decorations, my family was planning to steal it. Not borrow it, not ask for it, steal it. You'd think anger would hit first, or shock. Instead, what I felt was clarity, cold, precise clarity. They had forgotten who I was. I don't explode when something goes wrong. I don't shout or slam doors. My job is literally to assess threats, evaluate risk, and eliminate liabilities before they destroy the system. Standing there in the rain, I realized something important. They thought I was still playing defense. Slowly, I looked down at my hands, flexed my fingers once, and took a steady breath. Then I smoothed my expression the way I'd done before. Hundreds of high-stakes negotiations. Calm, pleasant, harmless. A holiday smile. By the time I lifted my hand and knocked, the mask was perfectly in place. The door opened a few seconds later. "Merry Christmas," I said brightly as I stepped inside. The silence that hit the room was heavy enough to feel 4 faces turned toward me at once. My parents, my sister, Blake. For a split second, the expressions on those faces were raw panic. The kind you see when someone walks in on a secret meeting halfway through the conspiracy. Then it vanished. My mother rushed forward, wiping her hands on her apron as her expression transformed into warm maternal delight. "Morgan, sweetheart," she said, wrapping me in a hug that felt stiff and oddly hollow. "We didn't expect you until 7. The traffic must have been awful." "It cleared up," I said smoothly. Over her shoulder, I saw the table behind them. A few papers were being shuffled out of sight a little too quickly. Floor plans, maybe. My father cleared his throat and stepped forward, studying me the way someone studies a poker player they're trying to read. "Good to see you, Morgan," he said. "You're looking successful. Strategic risk pays well, Dad," I replied. Across the room, Sabrina gave me a fragile little smile from her nest of blankets. Blake leaned back on the couch with a beer in his hand, offering a smirk that suggested he already thought the game was over. I hung my wet coat by the door and walked further into the house. Inside my head, the analysis had already started. Hostile environment. Multiple bad actors. Leverage ratio 0. They thought they were setting a trap for me. What they didn't realize was that I had heard the entire plan before I ever walked through the door. My mother guided me toward the dining room, like nothing unusual had happened. "Sit down, Morgan," she said brightly, gesturing toward a hard wooden chair near the edge of the table. "You must be exhausted from traveling." I took the seat she offered. The house felt exactly the way I remembered it. Cramped, humid, a little too warm. The windows were fogged from the rain outside, and the smell of pot roast hung thick in the air. Damp wool from coats near the door, mixed with the scent of overcooked carrots and gravy. It pressed in on you after a while. My loft never felt like that. My place was glass and brick and open space. Cool air filtered and clean, carrying the faint scent of cedar and rain from the waterfront. Light poured through tall windows that stretched nearly from floor to ceiling. Here the ceiling felt low enough to brush with your fingertips. While my mother fussed around the table, I glanced at the walls. They were covered in framed photographs. Sabrina at prom, Sabrina graduating college, Sabrina in a white dress at her wedding. There were dozens of them. I wasn't in a single frame. "Can I get you something to drink?" Susan asked, already reaching for a chipped mug. "Water's fine," I said. Across from me, my father sat down slowly, his elbows resting on the table as he studied me with quiet calculation. Richard had the posture of a man who believed he commanded rooms simply by occupying them. Next to him, Sabrina shifted in her seat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, like a porcelain doll someone was afraid might crack. Her hand rested protectively over the curve of her stomach. When she looked at me, her eyes were wide and watery, fragile. She had perfected that expression sometime around middle school. Blake, on the other hand, didn't bother pretending. He leaned back in the corner of the couch with a beer bottle dangling loosely in his hand. His boots were still on muddy soles, resting against the coffee table. He gave me a lazy nod. "Morgan," he said. There was always something faintly mocking in his voice, like he'd decided years ago that anyone with a stable career must secretly be doing something wrong. I set my glass on the table and folded my hands in my lap. Inside my head, the analysis had already started. In my line of work, you learn quickly that people reveal more through small details than through anything they say out loud. Body language, timing, eye contact. Signals everywhere. Susan kept hovering around Sabrina, adjusting pillows, bringing her food, smoothing the blanket over her knees. She hadn't asked me once if I needed a towel for the rain still dripping from my sleeves. Richard cracked his knuckles once then again. Blake kept glancing toward my father like a man waiting for his cue. Sabrina sniffed softly into a tissue, and the conversation, slowly, carefully, began to drift. "So," my mother said, after a few minutes, her voice light casual, "your trip to Tokyo is coming up soon, isn't it?" There it was, the first step. "Yes," I said calmly. "Early January." "That's such a long assignment," Sabrina murmured, shifting uncomfortably. 3 whole months. Her hand rubbed her stomach again. "It must be exciting, though," Susan added quickly. "Working overseas like that. Your father and I were just saying how impressive it is." Richard nodded, once his expression thoughtful. "Yes," he said, "but it also raises logistical questions." I took a sip of water and waited. Blake leaned forward now, resting his elbows on his knees. "Your place will be empty all that time, right?" he asked. The room went quiet. It was subtle the way they did it. No accusations, no demands, just a gentle narrowing of the conversation. I could almost see the funnel forming. Inside my mind, the risk model kept updating. Actors 4, objective secure access to property. Strategy emotional leverage. Likelihood of escalation high. Across the room, Sabrina winced slightly and shifted again, letting out a quiet sigh of discomfort. "The stairs here are just killing my hips lately," she said softly. My mother rushed to her side instantly. "Oh, honey, you shouldn't even be sitting upright like that," Susan said, fussing over the blanket again. Then she looked at me, only briefly, but the glance was deliberate. Richard leaned forward on the table, folding his hands together. "Morgan," he said, lowering his voice into something more serious, "we've been doing some thinking about Sabrina and the baby." "Of course you have," I thought. I kept my face calm, neutral, encouraging even, because the truth was, I already knew exactly where this conversation was heading. I had heard the entire plan before I ever knocked on the door. So, while they maneuvered the discussion carefully toward my condo, pretending this idea had just now occurred to them, I simply sat there watching each move like pieces sliding across a chessboard. And the strangest part, they looked completely confident, completely certain, like they believed the game had already been won. As my father leaned forward, preparing to deliver what he clearly believed was a carefully crafted request, my mind drifted somewhere else entirely. Not away from the room, just backward. In my line of work, you learn to keep records, not always on paper. Sometimes the ledger lives quietly in your head, waiting for the moment when the numbers finally add up. Mine was thick and written almost entirely in red ink. Blake was still talking about logistics, something about space, something about comfort for Sabrina. But his voice blurred into the background as the first entry surfaced. 3 years ago, Blake's disruptive tech startup. He had shown up at my loft with a presentation deck and a grin that suggested the future of Silicon Valley. Had personally selected him as its champion. All he needed was seed capital, $15,000. Family supports dreams, he'd said. So I wrote the check. 4 months later, the company collapsed. The money dissolved into networking dinners, conference trips, and if the photos on his social media were accurate, a leased sports car he called a branding investment. Return on investment 0. Across the table, Blake laughed at something my father said. I watched him lift his beer bottle. Exhibit A. My mental ledger turned a page. 2 years ago, my father's pension gap. Richard had called me late one night, his voice unusually tight. Something about union dues that hadn't been calculated correctly. Some unexpected medical bills layered on top of it. $8,000 would stabilize everything. It wasn't even a discussion. I wired the money the next morning. A few weeks later, I saw pictures online. My parents standing on the deck of a cruise ship somewhere near Cabo. Sun hats, tropical drinks, wide smiles. No one had mentioned the vacation. Sunk cost, another page. Sabrina's emergency credit situation. That one had come with tears. $12,000 in credit card balances, she said, voice trembling. She needed help consolidating it before the interest destroyed her credit score. She and Blake wanted to buy a house someday, start a family the right way. I paid the balance directly. 6 months later, she posted pictures of a purebred doodle puppy wearing a designer collar. A week after that came the photos of her fresh start wardrobe haul. The house never materialized. Across the room, now Sabrina shifted on the couch, pressing a hand gently against her stomach. Fragile, always fragile. I realized something then, sitting in that cramped dining room with the smell of pot roast hanging in the air. For years, I had been labeling their behavior incorrectly. I called it neediness or irresponsibility, sometimes just bad luck, but that wasn't the right category. What I was seeing now was a pattern, a system. My success had never really belonged to me, not in their eyes. To them, it was a communal asset, a resource pool waiting to be accessed whenever someone in the family felt uncomfortable or inconvenienced. My paycheck wasn't my paycheck. It was emergency funding. My home wasn't my sanctuary. It was unused square footage. My stability wasn't something to admire. It was something to tap. I wasn't a sister. I wasn't even really a daughter. I was infrastructure, the financial spine of the entire family. And infrastructure doesn't get asked for permission. Infrastructure gets used. Across the table, my father cleared his throat. Morgan. He began again, folding his hands together like a man preparing to ask for a kidney. We've been thinking about Sabrina's situation. The pregnancy has been harder than expected. My mother nodded quickly beside him. The stairs here are just terrible for her hips. Susan added, her voice full of concern. Sabrina sniffed quietly into another tissue. Blake leaned forward, elbows on his knees, suddenly very attentive to the conversation. The pitch was coming. I had heard versions of it for more than a decade now. Different circumstances, same structure. They would explain the hardship. They would frame the request as temporary. They would remind me how much family supports each other. And eventually, after enough pressure, they would walk away with what they came for. In the past, I would have pushed back. I would have explained that my home office contained proprietary data servers that couldn't simply be moved. I would have mentioned liability insurance, building policies, security protocols. I would have tried logic. Then they would escalate to guilt. And eventually I would surrender, not because they were right, but because it was easier than continuing the fight. That had been the system. But tonight, sitting there with the full weight of my mental ledger open in front of me, something shifted. The numbers had finally balanced. For the first time, I wasn't looking at their request as a daughter trying to keep peace. I was looking at it the way I looked at any risk assessment, input, pattern, outcome. And the conclusion was suddenly obvious. They weren't asking for help. They were preparing to harvest the last valuable asset I had left, my home. Across the table, my father inhaled slowly. And since you'll be in Tokyo for 3 months, he began. I lifted my glass of water and took a calm sip. Go ahead, I thought quietly. Make the offer. Because for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't planning to say no. I was planning something much worse. My father cleared his throat again, leaning forward across the table like a man preparing to deliver something delicate. Morgan, he began slowly, since you'll be in Tokyo for 3 months. We've been thinking about Sabrina's situation. Here it comes. The pregnancy hasn't been easy, my mother added, quickly placing a comforting hand on Sabrina's shoulder. The doctor says she needs to avoid stress as much as possible. Sabrina gave a small, tired nod, pressing her hand to the small of her back, like the weight of the conversation itself might send her into labor. These stairs are really hard on me, she said softly. And Blake's commute from here to work is getting longer every week. Blake shifted forward in his chair suddenly, very interested in the wood grain of the table. It's just temporary, he said. Until the baby comes, we just need somewhere calmer. My father folded his hands together, his voice adopting that familiar tone he used whenever he was about to present something he believed was completely reasonable. Your loft is such a beautiful space, he said. Quiet, safe, and it'll just be sitting empty while you're overseas. My mother nodded eagerly. It seems like a shame for it to go unused when your sister could really benefit from it. There it was, the request. Except it wasn't really phrased like one, more like a conclusion they had already reached. Sabrina sniffed again, her eyes shining with fresh moisture. I hate asking, she whispered, but the baby deserves a peaceful start. Across the room, Blake finally looked up at me. He didn't look nervous. He looked confident, like a man who had already spent the money in his head. I let the silence stretch, just long enough to make everyone shift slightly in their seats. In the past, this was the moment where I would begin explaining things. Practical obstacles, legal issues, security concerns, the many reasons why letting someone live in my loft wasn't simple. Tonight I didn't say any of that. Instead, I tilted my head slightly as if I were genuinely considering it. You know, I said slowly. 4 sets of eyes locked onto me. I hadn't really thought about the stairs here, I continued. Sabrina stopped dabbing her eyes. And the loft does get a lot of natural light, I added. It's actually very peaceful in the mornings. My mother leaned forward. Yes, exactly. I gave a small nod, letting the idea settle into the room. It might actually be perfect for a nursery. For a second, no one moved. Then my mother clapped her hands together with a burst of excitement. Oh, Morgan, I knew you'd understand. Sabrina's face lit up with visible relief, her shoulders relaxing instantly. Are you serious? She asked. Blake leaned back with a grin, already victorious. See, he said, glancing at Richard. Told you she'd get it. I took a slow sip of water before answering. I fly out early on the 29th, I said, calmly. I can leave the keys under the mat on the 28th. You can have the run of the place. The room practically exploded with gratitude. My mother rushed around the table and squeezed my shoulders. You're such a good daughter, she said warmly. Sabrina wiped fresh tears from her eyes, though now they were tears of relief. This means everything to us, she whispered. Blake lifted his beer bottle in a casual toast. Don't worry, he said. We'll take good care of it. I smiled politely. I'm sure you will. My father stood and reached for the wine bottle I'd brought with me. Well, he said, examining the label with exaggerated admiration, this calls for a toast. Glasses were poured. Voices filled the room again. They clinked their glasses together, celebrating their victory. To them, the problem had just solved itself. They thought they had secured a luxury apartment for free. They thought they had won. I lifted my glass with them and took a small sip. The wine tasted smooth, expensive, and as they laughed and planned furniture arrangements and nursery colors, I felt something settle quietly into place inside my chest. A kind of cold, perfect calm. They were drinking to their new home. I was drinking to something else entirely. The demolition I left my parents' house about an hour later. I blamed the early flight, said the travel had finally caught up with me. My mother hugged me again at the door. My father clapped my shoulder like we'd just closed a successful deal, and Sabrina called out another grateful thank you from the couch. The moment the heavy oak doors shut behind me, the warm, damp air of that house disappeared. Cold rain filled my lungs instead. I stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds, letting the water soak into my hair, letting the quiet settle around me. Inside the house, they were probably still celebrating, talking about nurseries and furniture and the generous sister who had solved all their problems. I got into my car and drove home. My loft was dark when I walked in. I didn't turn on the lights. The place still smelled faintly of cedar and rain, just like it always did. For a moment, I stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the silence of the space they had already claimed in their minds. Then I walked straight to my office. The server rack hummed softly as I powered up the monitors. Screens flickered to life, casting pale light across the exposed brick walls. I pulled up the security system and opened the archive. If I was going to do what I was thinking about doing, I needed to be certain. No assumptions, no speculation, just evidence. I scrolled back 48 hours. December 22nd, 2:14 p.m. The camera facing my front door showed it clearly. The door opened. My father stepped inside first. He looked over his shoulder, quickly the way someone does when they know they shouldn't be somewhere. But the expression on his face wasn't nervous. It was confident. In his hand was a key, a spare. I never gave him one, which meant he'd taken it. Probably from my bag the last time I visited for Thanksgiving while I was in the kitchen washing dishes. Behind him came Blake. He waddled in with a tape measure already clipped to his belt. "It's bigger than I thought," Blake said, his voice thin but clear through the audio feed. He walked into the center of the living room, boots scraping across the hardwood floors I had spent weeks restoring by hand. "We could fit a 70-inch screen right there," he added, pointing at the wall opposite the windows. "Focus," my father said. Richard moved straight down the hallway and pushed open the door to my office. I watched him step inside. He stood there for a moment, scanning the room, the dual monitors, the server rack, the certifications framed on the brick wall. He didn't see a career. He saw square footage. "This is it," he said finally. "This is the nursery." Blake wandered in behind him, running his hand along the brick wall. "The brick's kind of ugly," he said casually. "Too industrial." My chest tightened. "Sabrina wants something softer," he continued. "Maybe drywall over it or just paint it white." "Paint it white." I stared at the screen. That brick was original to the building 1920s masonry. I had spent 3 weeks cleaning with a toothbrush and specialty solvent to bring back to life. My father shrugged. "Morgan won't notice," he said. Blake laughed. "Yeah," he agreed. "She's never here anyway." Then came the line that settled everything. "By the time she gets back from Tokyo, Richard said she'll get used to it. She always adjusts." I leaned back slowly in my chair. There it was. The assumption that had powered every decision they'd made for years. Morgan will adjust. Morgan will fix it. Morgan will absorb the damage. On the screen, Blake was already measuring the walls for the nursery. My father was discussing where the crib might go. They moved through my home, like developers, walking through an empty lot. I closed the video. The screen went black, and with it, the last tiny thread of doubt disappeared. For a long moment, I just sat there in the dim glow of the monitors, listening to the quiet hum of the servers. Then I reached for my phone. There was someone and I needed to call. I sat alone in the dim glow of my office, the security monitors fading to black one by one. For a moment, I didn't move. The loft around me was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that used to feel peaceful, safe. Now it felt different, not violated exactly, just finished. I stood and walked slowly through the living room, past the tall windows streaked with rain. The exposed brick walls glowed faintly in the streetlight, filtering through the glass. I ran my fingers along the surface, out of habit, feeling the rough texture I had spent weeks restoring. 3 weekends with a toothbrush and specialized cleaner. Every inch of that brick had been scrubbed by hand. Blake wanted to paint over it. White? I let out a quiet breath and moved back toward my desk. The phone was still in my hand. There was one person I knew who would answer this late without asking too many questions. I scrolled through my contacts and tapped the name. Julian Mercer. The phone rang once, twice. Then his voice came through smooth and alert in a way that suggested he hadn't been sleeping anyway. "Morgan," he said. "This is late for a risk assessment." "I have a proposition," I replied. There was a slight rustle on the other end, probably him sitting up. "I'm listening." "You're still interested in the Pioneer Square loft?" It wasn't phrased as a question. A pause settled over the line. The kind of pause people take when their brain suddenly realizes something unexpected just happened. "You're selling Julian?" finally asked. "I am." Another pause. "I thought that place was personal," he said carefully. It was. I looked around the room again. The brick, the windows, the floor I had polished until it reflected the afternoon sun like water. Now I saw something else. Square footage, location, market value. "It's an asset," I said calmly, "and I need to liquidate." Julian exhaled slowly. "What are we talking about?" $360,000 cash. That number hung in the air. The loft had been appraised at $420 less than 6 months earlier. 60 under market, he said. "Yes." "You're serious?" "Very." I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. "What's the catch?" he asked. "There are 2 conditions." "Of course there are." "First," I said, leaning back in my chair, "we close in 48 hours. Julian gave a quiet laugh. "That's aggressive even for you." "And the second?" he asked. I glanced once more toward the hallway that led to my office, the future nursery. "Demolition begins December 28th, I said. Silence. "I want a full gut renovation," I continued calmly. "Walls down, floors ripped up, plumbing exposed." Julian didn't speak. "Your crew arrives at 10 a.m., I added. "I want the place uninhabitable by lunch." When he finally spoke, his voice was slower. "You want me to destroy a historic restoration." "I want you to remodel," I corrected. "You've always said the layout was inefficient." "That's true." I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the ceiling beams. "Make it open concept, make it yours." Another pause stretched across the line. "Longer this time?" Then Julian said something interesting. "Someone hurt you." It wasn't a question. I smiled faintly. Someone underestimated me. The silence that followed felt different. Not confusion. Recognition. Julian had made a career out of spotting leverage in other people's blind spots. And in that moment, he understood exactly what kind of opportunity had just appeared. "Send the contract," he said. "You'll have it tonight. I'll wire the deposit within the hour." I ended the call and set the phone down. For a long time, I just sat there. Then I stood and walked slowly across the loft one final time. The place looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Same walls, same floors, same light pouring through the glass. But the meaning had changed. The sanctuary was already gone. The moment my father unlocked that door without permission, the moment Blake started measuring the walls for their nursery, it had stopped being a home. Now it was just collateral, and in 48 hours, it would belong to someone else. The next 48 hours moved with the quiet efficiency of a controlled demolition. I I didn't pack like someone preparing for a move. I packed like someone erasing evidence. Every object in the loft that had real value disappeared first. The servers from my office were carefully disconnected and sealed into shock-proof cases. The artwork I'd collected from small local galleries, pieces I'd spent years curating, was wrapped and cataloged. The rugs, the lighting, the espresso machine, even the antique chair by the window where I used to read on Sunday mornings. Gone. By noon, the following day, a climate-controlled storage unit across the city held everything that actually mattered. The lease was under an LLC my father would never think to search for. When I walked back into the loft afterward, the space echoed. Bare walls, empty floors, just the faint smell of cedar lingering in the air. But I couldn't leave it empty. That would raise questions. They expected a furnished luxury home waiting for them. Something comfortable, something generous. So I gave them a stage set. The Goodwill outlet on the edge of Seattle sells furniture by weight. Most people go there looking for cheap finds. I went there looking for the opposite. The sofa I chose had a faded brown fabric that smelled faintly of wet dog and cigarette smoke. One of the springs pushed upward just enough to make the center cushion dangerous. Perfect. The dining table looked sturdy from a distance, but one leg was half an inch shorter than the others. Any glass set on it would wobble just slightly. I added mismatched chairs, a coffee maker that leaked from the bottom seam, and mattresses that felt like they were stuffed with gravel. Everything looked normal at a glance, but the moment you sat down, or leaned back, or tried to sleep, the illusion would crack. Back in the loft, I arranged the furniture carefully. The scratching sofa went exactly where Blake had imagined mounting his 70-inch television. The crooked dining table sat proudly under the pendant light, like a centerpiece. The bedroom held the miserable mattress Sabrina would discover the first night she tried to sleep. From the doorway, the place looked lived in, close enough to fool anyone who wasn't paying attention, which historically had been my family's specialty. Once the stage was set, I moved to the final piece. The closet in the master bedroom, the room Sabrina had already mentally claimed. On the top shelf, I stacked 4 large boxes and wrapped them in elegant gold paper. I even tied neat bows across each lid and attached name tags in careful handwriting. Dad, Mom, Sabrina, Blake. They would assume the boxes were housewarming gifts. Sheets, towels, maybe baby supplies. Something thoughtful from the generous sister who had solved all their problems. Inside Richard's box were 5 years of receipts, union dues, medical bills, utility payments. Every quiet transfer I had made since his pension problem began in 2019. On top of the stack sat a single sheet of paper. Payment services terminated, effective immediately. Susan's box contained credit card statements from the department store account she thought had an endless balance. For years, I had quietly paid the minimums to keep the collectors away. The final page was a notice of account cancellation. Along with the phone number of a debt consolidation agency I had already informed they were no longer representing her. Blake's box held loan documents, his failed crypto mining venture. He believed the debt had been forgiven after the business collapsed. It hadn't. I had simply purchased the liability and buried it. Now the paperwork transferring the debt back into his name sat neatly inside the box. Sabrina's was the smallest. Inside was a single cancellation notice. The premium health insurance plan she insisted she needed during pregnancy. The gold tier coverage she thought her husband had somehow arranged. I'd been paying it for 14 months. Until now. I closed the final box and placed the lid carefully. For years, I had been the invisible dam, holding back the floodwaters of their financial chaos. Today, I was blowing the dam open. I stepped back and looked at the 4 glittering packages lying neatly on the shelf. From the outside, they looked generous, festive, almost loving. But inside those boxes was the only gift I had left to give them: the truth. Morgan sat in the corner of the airport lounge with a clear view of the runway and her laptop angled carefully away from anyone passing behind her. The low hum of conversation and rolling suitcases blended into white noise. On the screen, 4 security camera feeds showed the loft. She had installed them months ago under the excuse of upgrading the smart system. None of them had questioned it. They rarely questioned anything that made their lives easier. The front door opened. Her mother walked in first, clutching her purse like a trophy. Her brother followed, with 2 suitcases, already complaining about the stairs. Her father stepped in last, slow and skeptical, scanning the room. Morgan leaned back slightly, watching. The loft looked exactly the way she had designed it to. At a glance, it appeared fully furnished. A couch sat in the center of the living room. A coffee table rested on a faded rug. A dining table stood near the windows. Lamps glowed softly in the corners. Everything suggested comfort, stability, permanence, but the illusion collapsed the moment anyone used it. The couch was stiff, its cushions flattened and uneven. The thrift store table wobbled if anyone leaned on it. The chairs were mismatched and uncomfortable, one leg subtly shorter than the others. The lamps cast dim yellow light because the cheapest bulbs she could find barely worked. Every drawer was empty. Every cabinet held nothing. No photos, no decorations, no electronics worth more than $20. The loft looked lived in, but no one actually lived there. Her mother walked into the living room and frowned. This furniture? Is this new? Her brother dropped onto the couch and immediately shifted. God, this thing's like sitting on bricks. Morgan smiled faintly and sipped her coffee. It was working exactly as intended. They began exploring opening cabinets and doors, their voices drifting through the tiny laptop speakers. Where's the TV? I thought she had a big one in here. Did she move everything already? Her father walked toward the hallway closet. Morgan straightened slightly. He opened the door. Inside, exactly where she had left them, sat 4 neatly wrapped boxes on the shelf, each one labeled in black marker. Dad, Mom, Kyle, Rachel. Her father stared at them. What's this? Her mother came over immediately. Probably welcome gifts. Kyle snorted. She's not that nice. Morgan muted the camera audio for a moment and glanced toward the airport window. A plane rolled slowly toward the runway. Boarding for her flight would begin in 15 minutes. She turned the sound back on. Kyle grabbed his box first, tearing the paper off carelessly. Inside was a thick envelope. He pulled out the documents and began flipping through them. His smirk disappeared. What the hell is this? Her mother opened hers next. Inside were bank statements, transfer records, copies of tuition payments, rent coverage, credit card settlements, all meticulously organized. Across the top page of each stack was a single letter. For years I've been helping you quietly. These are the records. And beneath it, effective today, all support has ended. Kyle's voice rose. She's been paying my rent. Her mother's chair scraped loudly across the floor as she stood. This has to be a joke. Her father opened his box last. His documents included mortgage bailouts, medical bills. Morgan had quietly covered tax penalties she had paid without telling him. And the final page. A cancellation notice? Silence filled the loft. Then, a loud pounding echoed from the front door. Everyone froze. The pounding came again harder. Security, a voice shouted. Her brother marched to the door and yanked it open. Two uniformed building security officers stood outside. Behind them, visible through the hallway windows, workers in bright demolition vests unloaded equipment from trucks. One of the officers stepped forward. Are you the occupants of this unit? Yes, her mother snapped. We have permission to be here. The officer glanced down at a clipboard. This property was sold this morning. The words hung in the air. Sold, her father said. Yes, construction begins today. As if on cue. The first crash echoed through the building, metal striking drywall somewhere down the hall. Kyle stepped forward angrily. You can't start construction. We live here. The second officer shook his head. No, sir. He pointed toward the open door. You're trespassing. Behind them, the demolition crew rolled a cart of tools toward the neighboring unit. Another loud smash shook the hallway. Morgan watched the chaos unfold from the quiet airport lounge. Her mother shouting, Kyle waving papers. Her father standing frozen with the documents in his hands. 4 gift boxes open on the cheap coffee table, 4 lifelines exposed, and every single one of them cut. On Morgan's laptop screen, the illusion she had built for them collapsed, exactly as planned. Overhead, the airport speaker chimed. Now boarding, autumn had settled gently over Kyoto, painting the hills in quiet shades of copper and gold. Morgan sat at a small wooden table beside the open window of her apartment, steam rising from a cup of green tea. Somewhere down the narrow street, a bicycle bell chimed and faded into the distance. The envelope had arrived that morning. International postage, familiar handwriting. She had known who it was from before turning it over. Sabrina. Morgan slid the letter from the envelope and unfolded the pages. The paper was creased, written in rushed lines that grew messier toward the bottom. The story inside it was predictable. After the eviction from the loft, everything had unraveled quickly. Without Morgan's quiet financial support, bills piled up faster than anyone expected. Rent that had once been manageable suddenly wasn't. Credit cards that had always seemed under control were maxed out. Sabrina wrote about arguments about the family, blaming each other, about temporary apartments and jobs that didn't last. Kyle had moved twice in 3 months. Their father was trying to refinance something he could no longer afford. Their mother, according to the letter, still insisted Morgan would eventually come to her senses. Sabrina's closing paragraph was softer. She said the family needed help, that Morgan had always been the one who fixed things, that everyone hoped she might reconsider. Morgan lowered the paper slowly. A year ago, reading something like this would have crushed her. She would have felt the old pull immediately, the tightening in her chest, the instinctive guilt, the belief that if she didn't step in, everything would fall apart. Because for years that had been true. She had been the quiet safety net beneath their lives, the invisible solution. Morgan folded the letter again carefully this time and set it beside her tea. Outside wind stirred the leaves of a maple tree along the street. She watched them for a moment. The guilt she expected didn't arrive. What she felt instead was a strange, steady clarity. Their lives had collapsed because they had been built on something that was never meant to hold that much weight. Her. For the first time in years, Morgan understood that stepping away hadn't destroyed them. It had simply revealed the truth, and in doing so, it had finally given her something she had never truly had before. Her own life. Sometimes the hardest boundary to set is the one that finally ends the cycle. Morgan didn't win an argument. She simply stepped away and let reality speak for itself. Consequences have a way of revealing truths that words never can. And somewhere, far from the noise, she found something she hadn't felt in years. Quiet. Real peace. If this story made you think about boundaries in your own life, I'd be curious to hear your perspective, and I appreciate you being here to listen.